Hello and welcome to Hampton 3 Gallery Coffee and Conversation. I'm Luke DeLell, the curator here, and we are today talking with Paul Yanko about his new body of work. Paul, before we get into the details of this work, you want to give just a brief bio
Sure.
of kind of your art career up to this point.
I am originally from Youngstown, Ohio. I received my undergraduate training in illustration at the Cleveland Institute of Art. Then I went on to Kent State University to study painting, where I received my MFA in painting in 1995. I was also serving as a graduate teaching assistant at that time, so you might say that's when I began my teaching career in a way that was parallel with my studio practice and professional career. I worked in the northeastern Ohio region, teaching and exhibiting with my wife, Enid Williams, until 2004. At that time, after a national job search, I had found a full-time teaching appointment at South Carolina Governor's School for the Arts and Humanities. So I've been based here in Greenville since '04, so nearly 20 years. Our studio is located in our home. It's been a really productive experience being here. I've been with Hampton 3 Gallery since about 2009.
Before we get into, because I know there's going to be a lot of questions about the technique and the way that these pieces are completed, let's talk a little bit about the themes. Specifically, I want to talk about stuff from your childhood that you're remembering, objects and that sort of things that you're bringing to the fore that you remember as a kid, and then we'll get into the landscapes after that.
Well, I was an only child. I grew up living in my own head. I had access to materials to make art with. I had access to things to build with. Even though I had a social network established enough with friends, still a very different experience growing up as an only child. I had a lot of support and encouragement from my mother to study and pursue art. Took art lessons at a very young age. The experience of interacting with things like building sets, for example, just really lodged with me. Sometimes you might put those things in the past, or other times they might stay with you and remain on your thoughts as an adult, especially as an artist, reflecting on their appearance, their use, their function. My mother was also a career educator, teaching mostly kindergarten level, and I've said in the past that that was the best room in the school in terms of how engaging it was as an environment. Every part of the room was colorful, and I spent quite a bit of time growing up helping her in the classroom and being part of that environment. I think that was a very formative influence on me.
Yeah, because there's a major tactility to learning at that very young age, and your mom had a lot of different toys and stuff that would be taught
Right.
that were physical.
And I still have some of those. I made it a point to retain those and collect those toys that were very basic and taught, very simple but important lessons in terms of how to order something, how to stack something, how to start thinking about volume, how to start thinking about fractional parts of a shape, their color, their design, as you said, their tactile qualities all kind of came together. I still have many of those things in a collection and think about them when I'm working in the studio.
There's a specific kind of visual language and communication that can happen with that kind of interaction between color and shape and also physicality. Is that something that you kind of try to speak through your work?
I think that painting can be about illusion. There are certainly well-established conventions that can allow foreground to be clearly distinguished from background and scale and contrast and things like that. But then there's this material fact of a painting, that another space that painting can occupy. No longer about, one medium being better suited to communicate illusion and one being better suited to express ideas about form or dimensionality. I think in this point in time, you can be more hybrid.
Speaking of distinctions, let's talk about fences and let's talk
Right.
about Texas. Can you talk a little bit about the inspiration for some of these works?
My wife Enid is from Texas, and so for nearly 30 years, I have been making the trip with her to visit family in central Texas. Typically, we're driving. It's a long trip. It's a long, straight drive out there. There are many interesting features of the terrain that change along this drive, going from intensely urbanized, developed regions into much more remote, rural spaces. As we're getting closer to Texas, there's a pronounced change in the terrain, the topography. The state is fairly densely forested from the east, and then as you're moving westward, it becomes more arid and more akin to rolling plains. Not total desert, but it's an interesting transitional kind of landscape. The skies really are as big as they say. Relationship to the space is a very, very different. You might have experience here in the southeast. Of course, fencing exists everywhere, but it has a particular role in the conversation about property, specifically large ranches, more vast tracts of land, that's very different. For years, I would view fencing on really nice ranches and the kind of quality and the construction character of that versus something that was dilapidated or in disrepair. I was thinking about all the conversations, the anecdotes that I've heard about land and who is acquiring land or selling land, how these things are partitioned and demarcated. And I wanted to address that in an abstract way with this body of work. I wanted to respond to that nearly, 30 years of memories and experiences.
So I love a lot of these pieces, the mix between extremely organic forms and extremely man-made forms, a lot of angles and right angles, kind of how there's an interaction between man and the landscape. How are you thinking about that when you're composing these pieces?
I wanted to bring my experience of working with masking into this body of work. In some ways, it's not a complete departure from what I've done prior, but things are being configured differently, or the tape is being manipulated in a different way to allow some things to take on a little bit more of a stronger resemblance.
The interaction between the organic and the inorganic forms.
And so in some areas, I've wanted to loosely suggest features of a tree line, a mountainous ridge or ridge of hills in a manner that was a little bit more suggestive, but a little more generalized, so it's not too specific. I wanted to just see how close I can get in terms of suggesting something without defining it so specifically that it's identified as just being one particular place. It could be somebody seeing it, could identify it with something in another region of the country. I just wanted to get closer, but not exacting with that.
Yeah, you bring up taping. A lot of people have asked me about the collage that you do, and I keep having to say it's not collage. It's all paint. And I think I understood that at a certain level, but the last time I was in your studio and I actually watched you put a stroke down on the fence post piece that's by Sandy, I was like, oh, this is like painting. Like, it's gestural, and it involves a lot of hand skill and how you're taking the tape up, how you're applying the tape, at what point in the drawing process you pull the tape up, how you crack the tape. Can you talk a little bit about just the technique?
Taping is certainly not something that I can lay claim to. I think once any material reaches the market, very short order, artists are experimenting with it. Artists are considering its possibilities for applying to their work. It doesn't take long. Artists like, for example, Al Held, that I became familiar with as a student, found a way to control taping to the extent that it led to surfaces that were flawless, very, very pristine in their execution, very akin to what you would see in a context of like auto body work or something like that. Peter Halley is another one. I think to communicate what those artists intended about their work effectively, it needed to be that way. So I started to become much more interested in relying on the tape to give some structure, some guidance to things, but to not hold myself accountable for creating some of those kinds of surfaces. So when, I'll use like very inexpensive types of tape to allow the paint to bleed, to seep under it intentionally. In some instances, I might use a different grade of tape to create that more sharply delineated edge. But I've wanted to find my own answers, just follow a little bit of a different trajectory against that backdrop. I like the feel of stretching it, applying it. It slows things down a little bit. It's always interesting to remove it and see how closely I got to what I wanted or how much farther I still need to go to achieve certain qualities. So some passages are layered in 3, 4, 5, or 6 passes to not only get the color right, but to get a certain kind of physical density in the work as well. One layer just isn't adequate enough to do that. And I'm also working with a very extensive assortment of mediums with the acrylics that I use, ranging from molding paste to glass bead gel to various other types of gel mediums to modify the qualities of the paint.
Yeah, I think one aspect that's always kind of blown me away about your work is how you get away with such a broad palette. There's so many colors. And to achieve a sense of balance with that kind of chaotic palette is kind of insane to even attempt. But we were talking earlier this week about the idea of when you are driving to Texas, you're going through areas of, nothing. And it's just organic and it's just a landscape and it's just a plain. And then suddenly you hit a strip mall and it's these bright neon colors. Right. I think of these paintings as like a snapshot of the whole drive and all the colors. And I think something that some people miss about art is you really do have to have a defining factor to create that balance. Like, that is a drive. There's some sort of thematic reason why all those colors will come together. And how do you think through that when you're...
As a teacher, color theory is very present in my curriculum in design and painting classes. Over the years, you assimilate all of those ideas. When you teach, you teach yourself, kind of relearning some of these things each time you present instruction to a class. But then you're faced with the need to also find ways to subvert some of that too, and surprise yourself, upend some of the things that you might be very familiar with. I start with the selection process. When I'm at the supply store buying materials, I deliberately select colors from the most remote corners of the rack. It's funny to note how there are certain colors that are always out of stock and some that have probably remained in stock for years. And if it's there on my palette, if it's in the studio and it's accessible, I will find a use for it. It just has to be there. It has to be present. So I'll do that to myself. I'll challenge myself to use something that seems very, very unlikely, very improbable, like a light magenta for an underpainting, and then cover that with something and allow regions of that to show through. So that, the idea of pentiment, letting underlying layers of color, of activity inform what's on the top. I don't start with a rigorously developed plan for what the work will become, but I do expect decisions to become slower and more deliberate as I go, certainly. I like to use colors that give me a bit of a challenge to think about how much I want that to remain in terms of the quantity. And they could become more important than I ever expected as I work with them. For many of the paintings in this exhibition, green is used prominently, and it's because I wanted to allow an association to the landscape to exist, be a little more identifiable. As soon as I decided upon that, it became imperative to me to work as extensively as I could with a range of pigments and mixtures. There's just some things that you can't mix. It became important to me. Expand the palette, acquire these new colors, and start working with them. But especially in the early stages, all bets are off, and I don't really want to hold myself accountable to making the final choice. I like giving myself something to respond to.
Yeah, and I think to just sum up before we go to questions, I think the thing that I've always appreciated about your work, to kind of loop back to what we were talking about at the beginning, is when you're a kid and you're in kindergarten, you have the toys that are in front of you. You have the objects that are in front of you, and you have to make something imaginative from that. And the important part is having it in front of you. And some of the nostalgia and the emotions that adults have towards minor toys and stuff that like nobody else remembers but them is because that was what was in front of them, and that's what they had to play with. And I think some of the emotive quality of these pieces comes from you having the paint in front of you in order to do that, and going through that process at obviously a much more critical level than a kindergartner does, but tapping back into some of the purity of responding to what's in front of you.
It's always great to watch younger children at work, and they're just uninhibited. They just delight in experience the medium. They're undaunted by scale. It's so rewarding to watch that creation take place. And then it just becomes a challenge to retain that as you become an adult, become a professional in the arts. It's like a conversation I think we had recently about Andrew Wyeth painting in the early stages without any reservations. And you might not associate that with, but he did. That's what I try to retain in the early stages of the work. I know and expect the editing, the decision-making to become more difficult, more exacting in some ways. Initially, it's good to have that kind of drive, that just kind of openness, to start things out.
Well, let's go ahead and open it up to questions. Does anybody want to start us off?
Going back through my catalog of experiences of traveling there at various times of year, There actually have been some summers where rainfall was higher than expected. Pastures were beautiful. Everyone was happy. Yeah, the tanks were filled and the fields looked great, and everybody was happy, from cattle to landowners. Yeah. Pete, yeah. So I have experienced that. I've seen other times the terrain in more drought-like conditions, seen it change somewhat in winter, maybe not as pronounced as here or in the north, but I've seen that. So these are kind of a composite of that range of experiences of seeing these conditions, different conditions. On the drives that we make to Texas, the highway doesn't give you many choices. You are confronted with what was deemed by civil engineers to be the most efficient route, and then development has just kind of followed its own course along that. So on a long drive, you really do have this composite of new development in areas that have remained relatively unchanged, all scrolling by at a very rapid rate. And so it's pretty hard to hold on to a more romanticized notion of the space when you're not off of that road. If you are off of that road, you can make a deliberate search for a certain destination. You can choose to avoid things and not be reminded of that change, that encroachment, so many of these things. But on a highway, you're seeing it all. And just thinking about that and thinking about how it's changed over the years, thinking about what it will become or what was lost, I would say that the extensive palette, the vocabulary of shapes, the range of images are all kind of taking that into account. Again, there's this idea about creating an illusion of textures, surfaces, features of the landscape. I'm thinking about that, but then I'm also thinking about the layering, the application of various mediums to create physicality, an actual surface that corresponds to something like rock, like gravel. So that's where I'm using acrylic medium, but I'm also using some pieces of canvas that I've initially used to blot the paint over and over repeatedly in several pieces, and then incorporating that piece back into the work. So it becomes sort of like a closed loop. What I'm using to blot or alter the qualities of the paint eventually becomes incorporated into the painting. So then there's this interesting kind of history. That material is accumulating through being pressed over and over again into an area. In terms of surface quality, some of it's accumulating rather slowly, and then I'm collaging it, or it's going on pretty thickly, depending on the medium that I'm using. They have a kinetic quality that definitely could be associated with that. Not long ago, I bought a yo-yo. I just had to have one. I haven't had one in like 30 years, so I bought one. I went to the store and got a Duncan yo-yo. When I made this piece, I was thinking about something more derived from a plant, specifically something like a fern pushing out of the ground and uncoiling when they're coming back after the season. There's some things that are loosely kind of pushing my hand and guiding some initial decisions that serve a purpose to a varying degree in the project, but then the palette changes and they can become something else. That's where my interest in abstraction start to come into place. The ant. Okay. The ant, I'm making an homage to the ant for many reasons. As I'm thinking about the landscape in some of these pieces, I'm thinking about creatures that inhabit the landscape and interact with it. Again, going back to some childhood memories, I had a jigsaw puzzle that was based on an image of ants building things. So it was a very complex image. They were wearing construction hats and building houses and pyramids and things like that. It was really engaging to look at because of all the complexity, all the activity going on. The puzzle was surrounded by an alphabet and numbers, so it was also meant to be educational in that way. The palette was comprised of mostly yellows, yellow, oranges, and it's one of the things that I don't have in my collection currently, but I just started to think about. I just think it's a fascinating graphic, a reminder of my childhood. I just felt like I had to get that image out and establish it. There's also a portion of the letter A and a portion of a B on there, representing some of that alphabet in the way we might speak off getting from point A to B. So there's a little bit of a story there about a destination, journey. And some of the imagery in the interior of the painting references the network of tunnels in the layout. It's kind of a process, a structure, a network of things that's being built and modified by these insects.
Yeah, I think that there's in some sorts of modern painting where you're painting not just one piece in time or just one idea, but you're using the medium of painting to show a journey or memories that are overlapping with the current present time, because we're always living in the past in our heads. And so as we're experiencing even right now, we're thinking about things that have happened before and relating them to what is now. And usually that's not an idea that you would use leverage painting to address. You would pick another medium like music or something like that. And in older art, you would have an impossible scene with all these things happening at the same time, which obviously didn't happen, but you had to pack it all into one painting. And I think that your work, Paul, really achieves what that kind of painting is trying to do, but also resolving a singular image at the same time that works on its own, that can work outside of all the references that are within it, but still maintain the emotion of all the work that has been put in behind it.
It's always been, as a student of art history, it always was and remains engaging for me to think about symbolic meanings. One of my favorite pieces, Arnolfini Wedding by Jan van Eyck. This couple, who are they? Sure, there's a dog in the foreground, but the dog stands in for fidelity, loyalty. There's imagery of fruit in the background, and look deeper into the painting. You can just keep looking and looking into this piece to decode things. The way the symbolic qualities are considered has always impressioned me personally, and there's some of that embedded in this work as well. Like the fencing. Fencing defines, it demarcates things. It's erected to separate. It could also have weak points as well, or fail in some way. It's interesting to think about the look of it, but then also other meanings behind it, what that could stand in for. I don't know if I ever would have painted the landscape in Texas if I had not been there. When I was a graduate student, going back to my studies, I completed a fairly extensive series of paintings based on photo references that I took of features of the landscape around the family farm, and where family members that lived in Enid's family when we would go and visit. And I felt like I had to do that. To paint it was a way of getting to know it, to really understand it. I mean, to just look at a photograph that was handed to me in another part of the country or something would not have been the same experience. So I think it was critical to be there and feel like I had some honest connection with it. I think that speaking to that region, the repeated, ongoing, the regular visits have allowed me to feel that I could comment on things with a little bit more authority from the direct experience. It was really important. And I think here, the quality of light in this region probably had a very impactful influence on my color palette. I think that my trajectory as an artist would have been quite different if I had remained in the region of the country where I was living or located somewhere else. I don't have the deep connection that some artists do that's going back generations. I've had to consider my connection in different ways. So I think the quality of light and the clarity that it has had an influence.
I think people don't realize how orange South Carolina's light is compared to anywhere else. Like, our light is so orange. Further north you go, the more golden it gets. But here, especially early and late, it is orange. And I think Texas is probably pretty close to the same longitude, isn't it, where you're going? Or are you going high up or down low?
It's fairly similar,
Yeah,
based on the region of the state that we're going to. The vastness, the expansiveness of the space, that sense truly of feeling dwarfed against that. At times you can feel really diminished by it, but then other times you could become really engaged with what you're seeing close up in terms of the plant specimen, the terrain, and the rocks and minerals that make up the land.
Any final questions?
This work does represent a departure from my earlier vocabulary. I felt like I had, over the years, answered as much as I possibly could through the handling of the masking and the way that I was working with it. I felt like I had just exhausted the possibilities and completed a project. I felt like I had learned from it, evolved it to a level of mastery that I needed to. I felt like I was very much in command of it. So I started to have that conversation. What can I take with me going forward? What can I add to the toolkit? What other possibilities might exist that I haven't been working with as extensively? In addition to working with some of the density and opacity of color that I commonly used before, I started to think about glazing. I started to think about transparencies and adjusting my mixtures in ways that I hadn't. And then I started to feel like I was back to learning again. It's not something that I could force or place on some sort of arbitrary timeline. I just trusted my instincts. And when I felt like it was time, I broadened that vocabulary a little bit more.
Yeah, I found a lot of artists that I've worked with, when they get further on in their career, they may become, in a sense, a pure abstract artist, but trained as a representational artist. And they develop an extensive toolkit in how they make a mark or how they use color and shape. And then at some point, that representation that they learned so long ago kind of sneaks back in now that that vocabulary has been fully fleshed out and it can now be applied. Kind of something you feel that might be happening with your work?
I don't necessarily see my work becoming more reductive in the future. I think elements that are somewhat identifiable are going to be here to stay. The challenge will be how to get them to coexist, how to engage them with one another, and think about where they fit in the hierarchy of the work. I see that vocabulary being elaborated on.
All right, last question. So the question is, how do you arrive at a satisfactory completion with a project with so many things going on?
Right. That's always a good question. Completion of the work. It takes me a period of time to feel more or most secure about the work being completed. Ideally, it's a few weeks. It's a slow process, or I think it should be a slow process. I can start to recognize when I shift from having a fairly intensive engagement with the work, maybe working on it several days a week, graduating down to 2 days a week, and then 1 day a week. I might move the work physically to another location in the house and then view it on another day at a different time of day and ask, does this feel satisfying? Does it feel satisfying in terms of the surface quality, in terms of the interaction of color, the resolution of imagery? It's a slow process, but I've done it now for long enough to know that I can anticipate it being like that. It's just so difficult to make a decision in a really forced manner. It's a conclusion that you come to because the interaction, the engagement that you have with the work as an artist is so intense for months, perhaps a year. To just deem that project complete in a short amount of time is pretty difficult. So it's about trusting your instincts and arriving at the conclusion a little bit more slowly. I trust myself now more than I ever have as a result of my experience. It's just been a function of that time and commitment to the process to be able to accept that, to follow it. It's a difficult thing, but I think with the right amount of time, you can reach that conclusion.
Well, we have to reach our conclusion now. So
yeah.
Thank you guys so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Paul, for such a lovely show. And do hang around and ask more questions.